Welcome to this explainer. Today we're cracking open Thorsten Meyers' analysis called The Memory Budget Nobody Reads. We're going to decode exactly why your local LLM keeps, well, crashing on you.
Look, if you've ever set up a model, watched it boot up perfectly, and then had it completely fail right when you need it most, yeah, you're definitely not alone. Let's figure out why. So usually you size a machine for a massive model, let's say a QN3 235B, using the one calculation literally everyone knows. You take 235 billion parameters, multiply by 6-bit quantization, divide by 8, and boom, you get roughly 176 gigabytes of weights. This is the classic one-line arithmetic you see pasted all over forums when folks talk about hardware sizing. And honestly, it makes complete logical sense. You're just calculating the sheer physical space those weights take up on your hard drive and in your RAM.
Okay, so you look at your rig. Let's say you've got a massive 512 gigabyte machine. 176 gigabytes? That is comfortably under your 512 gigabyte ceiling. I mean, it's not even close. So you load it up, the system says it's running, that first prompt responds super snappily, and you think to yourself, I am totally in the clear. You've got hundreds of gigabytes of headroom, right?
But then, reality hits. 3,000 tokens, and analyzing a complex, long document, the generation just slows to an absolute crawl. We're talking agonizingly slow here, as memory starts swapping. Or worse, the whole thing just falls over and crashes completely. And there you are, left staring at a terminal on a machine that supposedly had hundreds of gigabytes of free space, just wondering what on earth happened to all that headroom.
You're left with this incredibly frustrating mystery, right? If the load succeeded without throwing any out-of-memory errors, and the math clearly checked out at the very beginning, why did the session just fail right in the middle of your workflow? Seriously, where did all that memory actually go? Well, here's the reality check. Your memory is actually holding 4 distinct things, not just that single weights line item you pulled from the model card. When an LLM runs, it's a living, breathing computational process. Asking if just the weights will fit, that's entirely the wrong question. The right question is whether the weights, plus literally everything else they drag along with them, are going to fit.
Let's break down these 4 competing demands. First off, the weights. That's your 176 gigabytes. It's fixed, it never changes, whether your prompt is a single word or an entire novel. Second is the KV cache, which is basically your linear growth working memory. Third, you've got the activations. Think of this as the transient scratch space the network uses during a forward pass to do all its intermediate math. And fourth is the overhead. This is the unavoidable operating system and runtime floor because, your OS always demands its cut before letting you do any actual work. These 4 demands mean you absolutely do not get to spend all 512 gigabytes on the model. You only get to spend what's left after the machine finishes being a machine.
But the piece that truly gets people, the silent killer of local inference, is the KV cache. This is the model's working memory of the current conversation. It stores the keys and values for every single token you've processed so far. That way, the model doesn't have to recompute the entire pass from scratch for every single new word it generates. Now, this is the exact magic that makes text generation fast, but it's also the culprit behind almost every painful local inference surprise you'll run into.
In practice, the KV cache acts kind of like a tide that comes in as your context fills up. Think about an empty prompt. The cache is practically zero. But as you feed it a long document, it starts growing. And if you're running a full agent transcript with tool calls and, say, hundreds of thousands of tokens, that cache grows linearly until it rivals a meaningful fraction of the model's weights themselves. Seriously, it can just consume tens of gigabytes out of nowhere.
So let's compare the 2 ways you can run out of memory here. A weights overflow? Well, that's honest. It fails immediately at load time. You try to shove an 800 gigabyte model into 512 gigabytes of RAM, it says, nope, and you move on. But a KV cache overflow? That is a cruel, deferred failure. It waits. It silently eats away at your headroom in the background while you work, and then it strikes deep into a long task. It happens exactly when you're doing the heavy, long context work you specifically bought the big hardware for in the first place.
Thorsten Meyers actually summarizes this trap perfectly. He says, "It loaded so it fits is the most expensive false conclusion in local inference." Just because a model boots up when the KV cache is completely empty tells you absolutely nothing about whether your session will survive, say, hour 3 of an intensive agent workflow. It's like you're measuring the ocean at low tide and just assuming it's never going to rise.
And honestly, this dynamic is even worse with modern mixture of experts, or MOE, models. These models are memory hungry twice over. Why?
Because an MOE establishes this massive fixed floor for total parameters. I mean, all the experts have to sit in memory whether they're firing for a specific token or not. That alone takes up a huge chunk of RAM right out of the gate. And then that creeping KV cache we just talked about stacks directly on top of that already massive footprint.
So this whole situation requires a completely new paradigm for how we do our math. The old trap was simply checking if your weights were less than your total memory. The real budget you need to calculate, it's adding all 4 line items together. You need your weights, plus the KV cache size for the absolute maximum context you intend to use, plus activations, plus the OS floor. All of that combined, the whole shebang, must be less than your total memory.
To survive long sessions without your machine totally freezing up, you need to follow these practical rules. First, size for your max context. If you plan to run a 100,000 token session, you've got to budget the memory for a 100,000 token KV cache. Second, treat that cache as a first-class line item in your spreadsheet. Third, leave a really generous margin for the OS floor, because the operating system always takes more than you think. And finally, when you are running out of space, remember you have 2 levers. You can shrink the weights by using a lower quantization, or you can shrink the cache by capping your context window or using a more cache-efficient model. Reaching only for heavier quantization when the cache is actually the problem, that's a rookie mistake.
This really changes how we have to think about local inference. Before you load up that massive model and start feeding it documents, you have to stop and ask yourself the only question that truly matters. Will your whole budget fit at your real context length? Because if you only account for the weights, the tide is eventually going to come in. So, are you still measuring the ocean at low tide, or are you finally ready for the flood?